At 0937 local time, an Australian P-8A Poseidon was cruising above international airspace, engine steady, sensors humming, crew settled into the familiar rhythm of a routine patrol. These flights happen every week, sometimes every day, and they rarely make headlines. The Poseidon's job is simple in concept and complex in execution. Watch the ocean, collect data, confirm what is already suspected, and quietly leave. Nothing about that morning suggested it would be different. Until the radar warning receiver chirped, sharp and unmistakable, announcing that something fast had entered the picture with very different intentions. From the north, a Chinese J-16 fighter closed the distance with casual aggression. Not a radio call. Not a shadow at respectful range. The fighter descended and accelerated, sliding into the Australian aircraft's blind spots, maneuvering with the confidence of a pilot who believed proximity itself was a weapon. For a moment, this looked like yet another unsafe intercept, the kind diplomats argue about later while pilots shrug and fly again. But this pass was different. The J-16 cut across the Poseidon's nose, rolled hard, and released a burst of chaff directly into the P-8's engine intake path. Not a warning. Not a mistake. A deliberate act that crossed from signaling into sabotage. Chaff is not harmless glitter. It is finely cut metallic material designed to confuse radar and overwhelm sensors. When ingested by a turbofan engine, it can erode compressor blades, disrupt airflow, and in worst cases force an engine shutdown. The Poseidon's crew reacted instantly, running checklists they trained for but hope never to use. Power was reduced, parameters stabilized, and the aircraft remained flyable. Professionalism prevented a crisis. But professionalism does not erase intent, and intent is what made this encounter different from dozens that came before it. Beijing would later describe the incident as safe and professional, language so disconnected from aviation reality that it revealed more than it concealed. Professional intercepts follow rules for a reason. They maintain predictable geometry, safe separation, and clear communication. They are designed to prevent accidents, not manufacture them. Flying close is one thing. Introducing foreign material into another aircraft's engines is something else entirely. That is not brinkmanship. That is coercion conducted at 400 knots. The Australian aircraft did not deviate from international law. It was operating in airspace open to all, performing surveillance that every major power conducts, including China itself. This is where the contrast matters. One side relied on transparency, routine, and established norms. The other relied on intimidation and plausible deniability, betting that speed and ambiguity would mask responsibility. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is the core of the strategy. Unsafe intercepts are meant to send messages, but they are also tests. Tests of nerve. Tests of restraint. Tests of whether professionalism will be mistaken for weakness. In this case, the test failed, not because Australia overreacted, but because the tactic exposed its own limits. The Poseidon landed safely. The footage and data were preserved. The incident entered the record, stripped of spin and excuses, reduced to physics, procedures, and facts. The real mistake was not flying close. It was assuming that recklessness would remain invisible. In modern military aviation, every maneuver leaves a trace. Every system records. Every crew documents. What might once have been dismissed as hearsay now arrives backed by telemetry and timestamps. The encounter did not demonstrate dominance. It demonstrated impatience, and impatience is rarely a position of strength. The jet flew away. The consequences did not. In the air, credibility is measured not by bravado, but by restraint, discipline, and ability to finish missions safely. What made the encounter resonate far beyond a routine intercept was not the distance between the aircraft, but the distance between doctrines. Western air forces train intercepts as communication. You identify, you escort, you signal presence, and you disengage. The goal is clarity, not confusion. Everyone goes home, and the airspace remains stable. The Chinese approach increasingly treats intercepts as leverage. Proximity becomes pressure. Unpredictability becomes the point. When chaff was released in front of the Poseidon, that difference crystallized into a single, unmistakable moment. To understand why this mattered, you have to understand the aircraft involved. The P-8A Poseidon is not a passive observer. It is a multi-mission surveillance platform bristling with sensors, designed to track submarines, surface ships, and aircraft across vast distances. It carries electronic support measures that record emissions, radar signatures, and flight profiles. When the J-16 approached, it was not slipping into darkness. It was flying into a net of recorders that quietly cataloged everything it did. Speed, altitude, angle, timing. The aircraft itself became evidence. The J-16, meanwhile, is a heavy multi-role fighter optimized for air superiority and strike missions. It is fast, powerful, and capable of carrying a wide array of weapons. It is not, however, designed for subtlety. When it accelerates, it announces itself. When it maneuvers aggressively, those maneuvers are visible not just to the target, but to every sensor network linked to it. This is the irony of modern intimidation tactics. The more dramatic the action, the clearer the record it leaves behind. Chaff deployment in this context was especially revealing. In training and combat, chaff is used defensively, released to confuse hostile radar-guided weapons. Releasing it in close proximity to a non-hostile aircraft serves no defensive purpose. It does not protect the fighter. It does not enhance situational awareness. Its only function in that moment was to impose risk on the other aircraft while retaining a thin layer of deniability. That deniability evaporates when engineers and pilots explain, in precise terms, what chaff does to engines and sensors. Australia's response was deliberately restrained, but restraint should not be confused with passivity. Diplomatic channels were engaged quickly. Allies were briefed. The incident was described accurately and publicly, not inflated, not softened. This approach matters because it denies the tactic its intended effect. The goal of such maneuvers is often to provoke either silence or overreaction. Silence suggests fear. Overreaction suggests instability. A measured response backed by evidence does neither. It reframes the narrative from confrontation to professionalism versus recklessness. There is also a broader pattern at work. Similar intercepts have been reported by Canadian, American, and Japanese crews operating in international airspace. Each incident follows a familiar script: aggressive approach, minimal communication, risky maneuver, followed by official statements insisting everything was safe. Patterns remove ambiguity. When the same behavior repeats across regions and targets, it stops being an isolated misunderstanding and starts looking like policy. The mistake, then, was strategic rather than tactical. By pushing too far, the intercept reinforced concerns it was likely meant to suppress. It validated the very surveillance it sought to intimidate. It unified partners who might otherwise debate degrees of response. Most importantly, it highlighted a contrast that is difficult to spin away. One side relies on rules because rules preserve freedom of movement. The other challenges rules because it benefits from uncertainty. In the long run, the side that treats safety as optional teaches others to plan accordingly. In aviation, margins exist for a reason. Every unnecessary risk narrows them. On that morning, the margins held, not because of luck, but because one crew adhered to discipline under pressure. That discipline is not dramatic. It does not trend on social media. But it is exactly what prevents accidents from becoming disasters. And when disasters fail to materialize, the tactics that invited them are exposed as hollow. Incidents like this are often framed as moments of tension between individual pilots, but that framing misses where the real weight lies. This was not a spontaneous decision made in a cockpit. Modern military aviation does not work that way. Flight profiles, rules of engagement, and acceptable behaviors are shaped well above the pilot's helmet. The J-16 pilot executed a maneuver that fit within a broader tolerance structure, one that implicitly accepted elevated risk as a tool. That tolerance is what matters, because it reveals how decision-makers value escalation versus control. For Australia, the mission itself was unremarkable. Maritime patrol aircraft operate in international airspace precisely because that space must remain open. If surveillance flights can be intimidated out of shared domains, then those domains quietly cease to be shared. This is why the response was never going to be a dramatic show of force. It didn't need to be. The flight continued. The aircraft returned safely. The data was reviewed. The signal sent was subtle but firm. Interference did not achieve its goal. The contrast becomes even sharper when you look at risk distribution. The Poseidon is a large, non-maneuvering aircraft optimized for endurance, not dogfighting. Its defenses are procedural, not kinetic. The fighter, by contrast, is built for aggressive maneuvering and rapid response. When a fighter deliberately introduces hazards near a patrol aircraft, it is not testing parity. It is exploiting asymmetry. That exploitation is supposed to create hesitation. What it created instead was documentation. Every close pass, every flare, every chaff bundle is logged not just by the aircraft involved, but by networks tied into them. Shared intelligence means shared awareness. The moment details were briefed to partners, the encounter stopped being bilateral. It became another data point in a growing body of evidence about how airspace is being contested. That accumulation changes planning assumptions. It affects escort procedures, mission routing, and long-term posture. None of that favors the side seeking ambiguity. There is also a human factor often overlooked in official statements. Military crews are trained to manage fear, but they are not immune to it. When risk is injected deliberately, it forces crews to divide attention between mission and survival. Doing that repeatedly does not make airspace safer. It makes accidents more likely. History is full of collisions and near misses born from misjudged bravado. The lesson most air forces internalized decades ago was simple. Professionalism reduces uncertainty. This incident ran counter to that lesson. The Chinese response afterward followed a familiar pattern. Language emphasized legality without addressing behavior. Statements asserted safety without engaging with mechanics. This works only if the audience lacks context. In this case, context was abundant. Aviation professionals understand what chaff ingestion risks look like. Engineers understand compressor tolerances. Pilots understand closure rates. When explanations fail to align with those realities, credibility erodes quickly. Perhaps the most telling element is what did not happen. There was no escalation in the air. No aggressive countermaneuver. No dramatic interception in return. That absence was deliberate. It communicated confidence. Confidence that norms still matter. Confidence that evidence speaks louder than theatrics. Confidence that allies would draw their own conclusions. In strategic terms, restraint can be a form of pressure. It denies the other side the reaction it seeks. The big mistake was assuming that intimidation would go unanswered. In reality, it was answered quietly, methodically, and collectively. The aircraft landed. The crew debriefed. The incident entered planning cycles far beyond a single patrol. When tactics designed to create fear instead produce alignment among those being pressured, they fail. Not immediately, not explosively, but decisively over time. What followed in the days after the encounter revealed why these moments matter long after the aircraft are back on the ground. Military signaling is rarely about the instant reaction. It is about how an action is interpreted, archived, and folded into future decisions. In this case, the Intercept hardened perceptions that were already forming. It reinforced the idea that airspace was becoming another arena where pressure would be applied just below the threshold of open conflict, relying on risk rather than restraint to shape behavior. For planners, this changes the equation. Surveillance missions are not canceled because of one close pass, but they are adapted. Crews review footage frame by frame. Engineers examine engine data. Legal teams assess compliance with international norms. None of this is dramatic, but all of it is consequential. Every unsafe intercept accelerates adjustments on the other side. Additional escorts are considered. Rules for documentation are refined. Communication protocols with allies become tighter. What begins as an attempt to intimidate ends by improving the resilience of the very missions it targets. There is also a broader strategic irony at play. Air power derives much of its credibility from predictability. Pilots trust that opposing forces understand the same margins and respect the same physics. When that shared understanding erodes, the air becomes more dangerous for everyone, including those creating the risk. Fighters operating aggressively close to larger aircraft place themselves inside envelopes where small errors are unforgiving. Wake turbulence, jet wash, and sudden maneuvers do not discriminate by nationality. A misjudgment at speed can be fatal, regardless of intent. This is why experienced air forces emphasize discipline as much as daring. Daring wins attention. Discipline wins longevity. The Australian crew's response demonstrated that distinction clearly. They did not dramatize the event in the moment. They flew the aircraft. They managed the systems. They preserved safety. Only afterward did the significance emerge, framed not as outrage but as fact. That framing matters because it invites evaluation rather than emotion. It encourages partners to compare notes instead of trading accusations. The long-term cost of such encounters is cumulative. Each incident adds friction to relationships that are already strained. Each one narrows the space for trust-building measures. Confidence-building mechanisms in the air rely on mutual restraint. When one side repeatedly pushes boundaries, it signals that those mechanisms are expendable. The response, inevitably, is caution layered on caution, escorts layered on escorts. The sky becomes crowded with contingencies that need not exist. From a psychological standpoint, intimidation tactics often misfire because they assume fear is the dominant motivator. In reality, professional military organizations are driven by procedure and precedent. When challenged, they do not retreat instinctively. They adapt systematically. The Australian flight did not end surveillance operations. It strengthened the rationale for them. It reminded policymakers why visibility matters in contested regions. It underscored that transparency, even when uncomfortable, is preferable to uncertainty. Perhaps the most telling contrast is between noise and effect. The Intercept was loud in motion, dramatic in proximity, and risky by design. The response was quiet, methodical, and enduring. One produced headlines for a day. The other produced planning changes that will last years. In strategic competition, that asymmetry often determines outcomes more reliably than displays of bravado. By the time the story faded from news cycles, its impact had already been absorbed where it mattered most. Not in press statements, but in briefing rooms and flight planning cells. The aircraft involved returned to routine operations. The region remained contested. The lesson lingered. Intimidation that fails to alter behavior ultimately reveals more about the insecurities of the actor employing it than the resolve of those targeted. In the end, the encounter distilled a simple truth that often gets lost in geopolitical noise. Power in shared spaces is not measured by how close you can fly, but by how reliably you can operate without forcing catastrophe. The Australian aircraft completed its mission. The Chinese fighter proved willing to gamble with safety. One approach reinforced stability. The other exposed its limits. When historians look back at these moments, they will not count meters or seconds. They will note which side trusted professionalism over provocation, and which mistook risk for resolve. Those distinctions shape outcomes long after engines go quiet.